Welcome back to the Narrative Monopoly Podcast. We are back from our pseudo summer break with a big one, Anthony Pompliano. Many of you just know him as Pomp. He is one of the biggest Bitcoiners, investors, podcasters, and writers around. This is a wide-ranging interview from everything from El Salvador to Bitcoin Beach to how DC will end up treating Bitcoin and how they should, to one of the most legendary takes on media at the end of the interview that you're not going to want to miss. This is the beginning of a huge slate of shows that we have coming up in the next few months. So definitely hit subscribe, and thanks for listening. Without further ado, let's press play. All right, on today's episode, we have Anthony Pompliano, perhaps the most well-known Bitcoiner. He's the GP of Pomp Investments, host of the Pomp Podcast, the best business show, author of the Pomp Letter, and last but not least, a veteran of our armed forces. Thanks for serving. How are you, Pomp?
I'm doing well. That's a long list that makes me feel bad about myself.
Bad about yourself. I think the best, most well-known Bitcoiner is definitely a crown to have at this point.
Yeah, I don't know if that's necessarily true, but I'm enjoying it and I'm learning alongside everybody else. So as long as I'm still learning and having fun, I'll keep doing it all.
Fair enough. So this show is definitely going to be mostly about Bitcoin, and the news of the day is El Salvador. So El Salvador is now the first country to actually accept Bitcoin as legal tender. So why don't you give the audience just a quick background of what just happened in El Salvador and why it's so important?
Yeah, El Salvador is obviously, in a unique position. They have about 80% unbanked individuals. 25% of the GDP comes from remittances, and they're a dollarized country. So they don't have their own fiat currency, kind of a local currency. They use the US dollar as that legal tender. And there's a relatively young politician who came from kind of outside the system, recently rose to power, became president. And he has a vision to use technology to vault El Salvador from kind of a developing third world country to kind of the first world order, right? How can he get to more of a developed status? And so one of the things that he's doing is embracing Bitcoin and the digital technologies that come along with it. And it's pretty unique. He did not replace his legal tender. He actually added Bitcoin as a second legal tender. So US dollars and Bitcoin are both legal tender. He has created a Bitcoin wallet called the Chivo wallet that essentially allows any Salvadorian to go in. They download the app. If you're a Salvadorian and you do this, you get $30 of Bitcoin right out of the gate as kind of a carrot to download the app. And then you can use that application to send money in the form of Bitcoin to anyone else who has the app completely for free. So if somebody in another country downloads it and wants to send it to you, it's completely free. From a remittance standpoint, it's completely free for a consumer to walk in and pay a business-to-business transaction, et cetera. So it's pretty, incredible effort that they've got underway here. It's not just legislation, but it's also some technology that they've helped build. And then on top of that, they're also setting up ATMs all around the country that allow you to exchange fiat for Bitcoin or Bitcoin for fiat. And so when you look at this type of experiment, there was already kind of a small scale example of how this could work down in El Zante, El Salvador, or also known as Bitcoin Beach. And basically, it's a pretty small surfside town where people started to embrace Bitcoin at the urging of a gentleman named Mike Peterson and his team who had moved there and were living there. And as the local population started to adopt Bitcoin, it became part of their circular economy. So people started to save in Bitcoin. They started to spend Bitcoin. Businesses started to accept it, et cetera. And it's actually proven to be quite interesting on that small scale. And so now it looks like El Salvador essentially is going ahead and doing it on just like a nation state size. And so there's really kind of two positive perspectives, in my opinion. One is It took 12 years for us to go from the creation of Bitcoin to the first nation state openly buying Bitcoin, and kind of embracing it as a legal tender. And then the second is, regardless of what you think about the individuals involved in terms of the politicians, the political parties, et cetera, Bitcoin is a technology that is censorship resistant. It is very unique in that nobody controls it, nobody can debase it, et cetera. And so as they give this to more and more citizens, essentially we're watching the real-time adoption of freedom technology. And if the Bitcoin thesis plays out, it's likely to lead to incredible economic prosperity for the citizens of El Salvador. And in some kind of beautiful way, those who need help the most, who live in a third world kind of developing nation, it looks like they'll have a shot at a better future, which is kind of why we're all here.
Now, a side note on that is a friend of mine, Miles Sutter, who has done a lot. I know he's a friend of yours as well, done a lot in the background for Bitcoin. He was the first guy, I think beyond Mike, to go down there, and he lived down there for 6 months. And I know firsthand, he sent me pictures and stuff of, exactly the idea that we have of El Salvador in our minds, which is just a very poverty-stricken place, and just talking about how it actually gave them hope. And so, the question I have for you is the reason that it gives them hope is kind of the goal for this thing to turn El Salvador into basically a place that lives off US dollars. It's actually, 23% of the country's GDP is dollars coming home. Is the goal to turn it from an inflationary environment to a deflationary environment, and through that channel, the country will actually become wealthier?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't think that the master plan strategy normally works out when building technology, when gaining adoption. I think that we know on a micro scale, the experiment of Bitcoin Beach has proven to be very, very effective, both from an economic kind of structure standpoint, but also for the individuals within that economy. And so extrapolating that out to a country, I think a lot of people think it'll be very positive. I tend to think that as well, but we're going to find out, right? Nobody knows what the future holds. Nobody can predict the future. So we need to be cautiously optimistic and kind of see how that plays out. With that said, fiat currencies are absolutely inflationary. They're structured that way. It's a feature, not a bug of the system. Bitcoin right now is still inflationary, right? It has this disinflationary monetary schedule, meaning that, yes, the amount of inflation is going down over time, but there's still a level of inflation today, and that'll continue until about 2140. So, still 100 years away or so. And at that point, then you'll get into kind of a deflationary type environment. And so I think that, there's a lot of folks who are worried about the deflationary.
And just to pause for the audience that don't know what you're talking about, you're talking about the halving schedule that basically will, the amount of Bitcoins mined every single, some period around like the blocks, right? And then it just it cuts in half and then continues to cut in half until we get to the 21 million that'll ever be mined.
Yeah, so there's 21 million total Bitcoin. The way that it is distributed into the market is every 10 minutes or so every block that is produced on the blockchain, there is a Bitcoin block reward that comes with it. Think of this as just the financial incentive for people to run the software, to verify the transactions, et cetera. And in 2009, that started out, it was 50 Bitcoin every 10 minutes. And that was, first 10 minutes, 50 Bitcoin, second 10 minutes, 50 Bitcoin, third 10 minutes, 50 Bitcoin. That continued for 4 years or so. And then after a certain number of blocks were produced in about that 4-year time period, it cut from 50 Bitcoin every 10 minutes to 25. So the halving or halvening, however you want to say it, is basically the idea of you cut in half the Bitcoin block reward. And so we had 25 Bitcoin every 10 minutes for 4 years, and then it cut to 12 and a half Bitcoin. And then that continued for 4 years. And then just recently we had a cut from 12 and a half to 6.25 Bitcoin every block. And so it's still inflationary today. 900 Bitcoin a day are still coming into the market. I can not only tell you that happens, but I can prove it to you. I can show it to you on a blockchain. And we will continue to have new Bitcoin entering the circulating supply every single day, again, for, at least 100 years. And so I think that the deflationary structure eventually will take over once all 21 million Bitcoin have been put into circulation. But we're still pretty far away from that occurring.
So I think that's a big question for people looking at El Salvador is if the currency, if Bitcoin is going to continue to appreciate in value, why would they use it on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah. So if you think about an asset, the asset is only appreciating against the US dollar. One Bitcoin is one Bitcoin, though, right? And if you think of dollars, nobody thinks about the dollar being volatile. Now, the dollar has actually been devalued at a historic rate. 38% of all dollars in circulation today were created in the last 18 months. And so if I compare, dollars to Bitcoin, the dollar's been crashing. If I compare dollars to the stock market, the dollar's been crashing. If I compare dollars to real estate, the dollar's been crashing. But we don't think of it that way. We just think I have $10 in my pocket, or I've got, $1,000 in my bank account, and I just denominate my life in dollars. I spend dollars. All the goods and services that I buy are priced in dollars. And so I think $1 equals $1. Same thing with Bitcoin. The big psychological change that is starting to occur, but will need to be accelerated, is this idea that goods and services are priced in Bitcoin, right? When they're priced in dollars, then you constantly think about the exchange rate. When goods and services start to be priced in Bitcoin, then you end up just denominating your life in Bitcoin and thinking of it that way instead.
Now, that's the ultimate goal, right? To have Bitcoin replace the US dollar as the medium of exchange?
I don't know if necessarily that's a goal. I think that I view it more so as the global store of value, right? Right now, if I said to you, what is the best global store of value? Most people historically would say, oh, sound money, right? I can simply buy gold and I can protect my purchasing power. What we found is actually that's not true, right? Gold is down over a 10-year period, and it's down almost double-digit percentage in the last 12 months. And so when you look at gold, it has essentially failed as a inflation hedge, as a safe haven asset, because that negative return over a 1 and a 10-year period is in the face of a historic bull market and also historic devaluation of the US dollar currency. And so when you start to look at that, you say, okay, well, where else can I store assets? You can store it in real estate. You can store it in the stock market. You could buy bonds, or you could buy crypto, right? Or Bitcoin. And real estate has advantages. It's somewhat scarce. There's a physical asset. There's got utility to it. I can live in it. I can rent it out, et cetera. I can drive cash flow from it, all that type of stuff. But it's not liquid. I can't sell a piece of the real estate. I got to sell the whole thing. And that's a process. And there's all sorts of market dynamics that go into it, et cetera. So you have an illiquid asset that is pretty robust and complex transactions to buy and sell it. And so there's advantages, but also disadvantages. Stocks have actually served as a great inflation hedge. If you invest in the stock market, you're up 30, 40% year over year, and done very, very well. Stocks, though, tend to be very susceptible to any sort of censorship or seizureship. It's very easy to freeze your assets in the stock market, things like that. On top of that, it also is very susceptible to monetary and fiscal policy decisions. So when we start doing all sorts of quantitative easing and stimulus and those types of activities, stock market usually takes off. People like that, right? Rich people want that to happen. It enriches them. But when we start talking about tapering or interest rate increases and kind of the more bearish type of monetary policy or fiscal policy, you then get stock market drawbacks or crashes. And so there's a reliance on that macro environment. There's a high correlation between those two things. If you look at bonds, for example, most bonds right now are actually negative yielding. I think over 80% of US bonds are negative yielding on a real rate basis. So if you think of kind of a 2% inflation as the target, historically, the bond yield has been something more than 2%. So you basically take the nominal return, let's say 2.5% minus the inflation, and your real rate of return was still positive. You're still making about 50 basis points on those bonds. So great way to not only preserve purchasing power, but also slightly grow it. What happens now is interest rates have been driven down to kind of the zero rate environment. And so you get very low bond yields. On top of that, we have very high inflation, 13-year high in CPI, 30-year high in core inflation. And so, CPI is over 5%. If I'm getting a bond yield of 1.5% to 2% on a real basis, I'm negative.
Well, not if you take out, not if you take out the inputs that the pieces of the basket. Recently, there was a press conference with one of the guys in the administration, and he's like, yeah, there's no inflation if you just take out everything that's inflated.
I think you're talking about this guy who is on the National Economic Council in the current administration. And what he basically said was, if you take out beef, poultry, and pork out of the grocery price index, then grocery prices haven't been going up nearly as much as people think, right? I think beef is up like 13% almost in the last 12 months. Pork and poultry are up, near double digits as well. And so when you look at that, you say, sure, if you took out all of the food from the grocery price index, it would never go up. Right. But obviously beef, pork, and poultry are kind of staples of a diet. And so it's hard to wrap your head around the idea of, well, if you just take out the core pieces of a diet and then look at the numbers, they don't go up that much. Seems to be a little bit more of a manipulation or massaging of the data more so than a recognition that inflation is here. It's not going anywhere. And it's probably something that we should have to deal with.
I mean, that's all part of the narrative monopoly, or as a previous guest, Jeff Lewis, likes to call the reality dysphoria industrial complex. You can spin your way out of anything. But now that we're on the topic of DC, let's shift gears for a second, because basically what happened with that the bill that passed the Senate in August, that is now on the House side, and it's probably going to become law. So Nancy Pelosi got rid of any ability to add amendments. And so that original Senate language is actually going to become law around, I believe it is, that basically like minors might be classified as brokers. It's basically like going to come down to what the IRS decides, if I'm not mistaken. How do you think that's going to impact domestic hash rate now that, a lot of it has moved onshore since China kicked out all the miners?
Yeah, I actually don't know how other people think about this, but for me, I'm frankly just not worried about it, right? The rules that are written on a piece of paper that are unenforceable are things that we should try to educate politicians on. We should try to make sure that they don't write the rules, but at the end of the day, they can't enforce these rules. And so I always talk about, jaywalking in New York City is illegal, but everyone does it. Why? Because it's not enforced. And on top of that, even if they wanted to crack down on it, they couldn't crack down on everybody. And so there's a difference between the letter of the law and the enforcement of the law. Now, that's not me encouraging people to go break the law or kind of do anything nefarious or malicious. It's simply the realization that if you say, hey, your computer needs to issue a 1099, the computer can't do that. And so you can put the law on a piece of paper, but if it's not physically possible, right? If it violates the laws of physics, then you basically get in a situation where you have to say to yourself, are we just wasting our time? And so I think that there are some people in the political circles who they're very well-meaning, they're very intelligent, they work very hard, and they're trying their best, right? They have good intentions, regardless of good or bad outcome. The intention is good, and they're actually trying to foster innovation, job creation, economic prosperity, and they want America to continue to be a leader in what appears to be a very important technology sector on a global basis. Then there's other people who know exactly what they're doing, and they frankly are bad actors, right? They are intentionally trying to shut down an industry. They're trying to attack it. Usually these are people who are backed by the banking industry or some sort of incumbent, credit card wires, Western unions of the world, et cetera. And when you think about the difference between the bad actors and the good actors is, I think ultimately the market flushes out the bad actors, the people who are doing things that are not in the best interest of their constituency. It may take a while to happen, but I do think that there is this kind of like natural cycle where those people end up kind of getting voted out. But that doesn't change the short-term impact of the headache that people have to deal with. And so there's entrepreneurs who are trying to build companies. They're trying to go out and hire as many people as they possibly can to kind of be a leader, be at the tip of the spear of innovation in this industry. But the more that they have to deal with, either uneducated rulemaking or some sort of malicious rulemaking, I think you're going to see, some people choose to leave, some people choose not to build a business, and then you're going to also see them outsourcing more and more of the work elsewhere. And so, it's a complex situation. There's no one answer, I think, that solves it. But I do think that we need to be aware of what's happening because it's definitely affecting, hundreds, if not thousands of employees, and then hundreds of thousands, if not millions of consumers. And so, we should be the leader in this stuff. We should embrace new technology. We should remember the way that we got to be the greatest superpower in the world is we were a leader of the Industrial Revolution. We built the most powerful military in the world. And it came from an entrepreneurial spirit and this pursuit of an American dream where people could pursue this life of prosperity and happiness rather than sit around and basically say, hey, I don't like you because you have more than me, or, you did something in the world that I didn't do, and therefore I should get what you get. I just tend to think that the whole idea of redistribution is somewhat of a loser's mentality. And instead, we should encourage free markets. We should encourage entrepreneurship, and we should encourage people to acquire the skills needed to go build a life of financial security, which is possible in the United States.
Yeah, I don't know when the United States flipped from a permissionless to a ask for permission society, but I think that that's something that is very clear at this point, that there's a lot of people in Washington specifically who do believe that we as free actors need their permission to do something first. Now, in terms of the people who know what they're doing, back to that question around what the goal is of Bitcoin, I personally think that the bad actors are looking at it as this is a threat to dollar supremacy, specifically, the petrodollar. And my question for you is, will there ever become a point where perhaps the United States embraces Bitcoin and says, okay, you can actually, we're now going to retether the US dollar to an asset, which is Bitcoin? Or is it just going to be this kind of never ending power struggle where it's open source versus the most centralized entity in the world?
I don't think that there's any resisting the end state. Right. What you find is when you have network effects, when you have momentum and inertia that's working in your favor around a technology, it tends to go global and be adopted by people everywhere. And so you basically have two separate responses. You can fight it or you can embrace it. And if you think of what Bitcoin is, it's simply an open, decentralized network of computers. And we've seen this before, the internet. And so countries had a choice. They could say to themselves, you know what, that internet thing, my adversary is going to end up using the internet to benefit themselves. We should sit this one out. We shouldn't use the internet. That our adversary is going to use it. And some countries did this. North Korea is a great example. It would suck to live in North Korea. Why? Because they have completely decimated their population. They have no access to information. They have no access to economic security. They have no access to any sort of upward mobility in society. They have no freedoms, etc. And so other countries like the United States said, this internet thing is cool. We're going to do everything we possibly can to make this a global technology. And we're going to make sure that if anyone benefits from the internet, the United States benefits more than anybody else. We're going to be a leader, right? We're going to be that innovator. We're going to be the challenger. And it worked out very, very, very well for the United States. I think the same thing is true here, which is as we continue to see this technology adopted, the United States and other countries have a choice. Sit it out or embrace it and be a leader. Sitting it out, I think, will have very negative consequences. I don't believe the United States will sit it out. I do think that slowly but surely we'll continue to adopt it in various forms. And I think ultimately the United States will wake up and kind of embrace this and end up saying to themselves, hey, we got to be a leader here. We have to be able to really go ahead and benefit from this. And my guess is that's what they'll end up doing is the United States will actually benefit from Bitcoin. Already, we've seen benefits on an economic basis from job creation, economic activity. The United States government has made a lot of money from taxes and elsewhere as revenue streams from Bitcoin. And so I think that ultimately Bitcoin is good for business. It's good for your personal finances. It's good for your corporation. It's good for your financial institution, and it's good for your country. And so when Bitcoin is good for business, I think that ultimately it leads everyone that the economic incentive is too strong for people to resist it forever. Just a matter of at what point do they capitulate.
Yeah, I mean, because this is probably the most common piece of FUD from the just like your average person is, oh, the government's going to shut that down, which is actually just a really sorry take on the world, just to assume that the government would just shut down Bitcoin just because. But how would the U.S. government actually become, or I guess embrace Bitcoin in the way that you see it? Like, is it is the Fed going to start buying Bitcoin? Again, would the dollar be able to be converted into Bitcoin? Like, what is the best case scenario for the U.S. just jumping in with 2 feet?
Yeah, frankly, I don't know what the right answer is, right? I mean, it's a super complex issue. I think the easiest path of least resistance and kind of the first step, if you want to walk before you run, is to simply empower the citizens to participate. And do it without a lot of restrictions, without a lot of kind of red tape, without trying to be onerous or overreaching. And if you're able to do that in a kind of the right way, I think that what you can actually return to is a situation where we say, look, we are one of the greatest countries in the world because we have very talented entrepreneurial people who understand the value of freedom and democracy. And they're going to go and they're going to apply those ideals, which frankly are Bitcoin ideals as well. Like Bitcoin is an American technology from an ethos standpoint, right? It stands for freedom. It stands for the lack of censorship. It stands for the resistance to authoritarian governments, et cetera. And so if you put that freedom technology in the hands of everyday American citizens, I think that you would be shocked to the upside as to what they're able to accomplish with it. But that takes some courage, that takes some intellectual humility, and frankly, it takes a belief in a better future rather than a kind of pursuit of holding on to generational power or legacy power. And so, I can't predict the future. But I definitely think that we're headed in the right direction. And probably the part that gets me the most excited is we have a number of leaders in the political sphere, everything from local mayors like the mayor of Miami, all the way up to congressmen like Warren Davidson and others, senators, Senator Loomis, and many others in the Senate, and then all the way into some of the regulatory bodies as well, the SEC, the CFTC, et cetera, who seem not only to be sympathetic to the ideal of Bitcoin and the ethos, but also to the entrepreneurs and the investors who are participating in the industry. And so it's not everyone. There's plenty of folks who, could care less about this stuff. But we're slowly seeing more and more Bitcoiners enter into positions of power and influence. And I think that's probably a good thing because you get people who are educated on it, who understand it, who realize the potential positive impact of it, and they'll continue to embrace the technology over time.
When you talk about the ethos, it really was the political philosophy that Miles personally sold me on. And also the essay by Nick Carter, A Peaceful Revolution. I mean, that's really what I think. I think a lot of people look at Bitcoin and the whole, store of value and wealth creation, all of that stuff is absolutely true and a huge benefit. But in terms of it just being a vehicle for freedom, that's what really excites me about it. I mean, it's really it's at the intersection of political philosophy, specifically freedom, monetary policy, code, energy. We could talk about the fact that it's actually going to be a net positive on the environment in terms of energy sources. We can get into that, but it's really just this smorgasbord of interesting areas that come together in one. I think that's why it's having such a profound impact on so many people.
Yeah, look, Miles is fantastic. And I think that he's been one of the people who's very far ahead in thinking about the importance of the ethos of Bitcoin and kind of what that can do to a society from a positive standpoint. And so I think that he's probably more right than wrong there. And it'll be really interesting to kind of see this play out over the coming years. But I always say, don't bet against Bitcoiners and don't bet against the idea of how powerful freedom and the promise of kind of a better future can be in rallying citizens to all work towards a common cause. Because I think that's what we're watching happen in real time on a global basis.
Miles was running a node out of the DoorDash office, which was entertaining to watch. But let's talk about putting Bitcoin on corporate balance sheets. So this is something that is becoming more and more conventional wisdom, but a lot of these people, especially in like Fortune 500 companies, they're obviously not the quickest movers around. But you have people like Kevin O'Leary, who is on your podcast, talking about how he's advising all of his portfolio companies to buy Bitcoin, put it on their balance sheets. You obviously have, Michael Saylor, who is probably going to end up the first trillionaire if everything goes to plan. So what is the actual benefit of a corporation trading in dollars for Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's no difference between a corporate balance sheet and a personal balance sheet, right? And if you're a corporation and you've got a lot of cash, Michael Saylor is the quintessential example. He had $500 million of cash on his balance sheet, and you're worried about any sort of currency debasement, then you've got to ask yourself, what do I do? And I think that he spent, according to him, over 1,000 hours trying to answer that question. He ultimately arrived at Bitcoin. And then he went out and he used his personal balance sheet. He used his company's balance sheet. And he also used the capital markets to purchase over $3 billion worth of Bitcoin in the coming months. And so far, it's proven to be a very savvy financial decision. But if he had taken that same money and he'd put it in gold or treasuries, he would have had a very bad outcome. And so I think that ultimately what you're watching is corporations wake up to the fact that they're not immune to these same problems that individuals are. They just have shareholders. They've got, larger amounts of capital. They've got businesses to run, capital expenditure, et cetera. But it's the same exact analysis and they're coming to the same conclusion. And maybe they're not going and all putting, 80, 90% of their balance sheets into Bitcoin, but many of them are still doing pretty material single digit percentages, which in some cases could be as much as, $1 billion+ dollars. And when you see that happening, it becomes pretty interesting because you start to understand that there's a lot of dollars in those corporate treasuries. And so as those CFOs or treasurers start to understand this technology and understand what it can do from a positive impact on their balance sheet, I would expect more and more of them to start to convert some of their fiat dollars into Bitcoin. Fixed supply asset demand increases, the US dollar exchange value has to move up to continue to accommodate everyone. So I think that it's a really, really strong tailwind, and it's a win-win. It's a win-win for the people who are holding the asset, and it's a win for the people who are converting their fiat into the asset. So it's a pretty unique mechanism that aligns interest of a lot of different parties.
So someone who kind of kicked the tires on this, still not really sure exactly what happened, Elon Musk. So what is the deal with Elon, his relationship to Bitcoin, and what happened with Tesla? Because I think a lot of people watching that from afar were like, I don't know what's going on here. It seems like he kind of jerked everyone around, but what's your take on that?
Yeah, look, I don't have any information that anybody else doesn't have. For those that weren't paying attention, he bought about $1.5 billion worth of Bitcoin at Tesla. My understanding is he bought a couple $100 million of Bitcoin at SpaceX. He personally bought a lot of Bitcoin. That was a pretty material part of his net worth. And then he publicly came out and said it. He's got a public company in Tesla. He has to, disclose that stuff. And obviously, when he bought it, it went up quite significantly. And in the following quarter, he sold about 10% of it as a way to test the market liquidity, or at least that's what they claimed. And so he still holds 90% of the Bitcoin that they bought. We have no reason to believe that he personally sold any Bitcoin or SpaceX sold any of the Bitcoin. And he's a holder. Now, along the way, he's got a big Twitter following, and he made, all kinds of comments, everything from talking about Dogecoin and other types of technologies to even going and talking about, trying to figure out the Bitcoin mining and the energy mix and many other types of, kind of inputs to that process. But ultimately, I think that he is bullish on Bitcoin. He holds Bitcoin, and he is likely to continue to invest in the ecosystem, whether it's directly buying Bitcoin, it's, building some sort of mining capacity. And sure, are there some bumps along the way? Absolutely. You got a guy who's trying to, land reusable rockets on drone ships in the ocean. He wants to go colonize Mars. You shouldn't expect, a pretty smooth sailing when you're rolling with a guy like that. But at the same time, I think he's been a net positive to Bitcoin and will likely continue to be moving forward.
I actually did not know that he continued to hold. So that's a great update and positive signal. Now let's, you're building a media empire right now. I think there's no debate about that. So let's talk about the media's approach to Bitcoin. So yesterday, the BBC runs this story about how there were, protests and tech glitches about, on the first day, and they get a picture of, a bunch of pictures of people saying no Bitcoin in El Salvador. They had this story written probably a week before it happened. And, they didn't pay attention to any of the people who were just lining up around the corner to help, getting the wallet set up. They did not focus on any of the positive stuff. You have, The Hill running an article saying, and these are all from the last few days, right? Cryptocurrency makes the climate crisis worse. ESG FUD. You have the New York Times running multiple articles, one about officials worry as the crypto boom invades banking. God forbid the officials worry. Then you have the New York Times saying, by simply existing, Bitcoin, the most popular cryptocurrency, uses astonishing amounts of electricity. Bitcoin network consumes around 91 terawatt hours of electricity annually, more than the country of Finland. Don't get into any of the benefits. It's all kind of this fear mongering. Why is the media taking this approach? Are you building the kind of the anecdote to this kind of like fear-based media environment?
I mean, it's really hard to kind of label with the broad brush all media. I think like anything, there's a lot of people who work really hard and have good intentions and frankly do a good job, right? My wife was a technology reporter at Fortune magazine for a long time. And I think that one of the things her and I, see greatly eye to eye on is the importance of journalism, the importance of a free press, the importance of kind of real work being done in order to hold people in power and influence accountable for their actions. And with that, there's a pretty rigorous process that goes into journalism. Unfortunately, what we have is a lot of the media outlets today don't practice true journalism, right? They're basically writing opinion pieces that are heavily biased. They don't go through the fact checking that they historically have. They don't talk to the sources to the degree that they have in the past. And on top of that, the individuals in many cases are young reporters who haven't had the training and they don't adhere to the same kind of code of ethics from a journalism standpoint. You hear, example after example after example. And so I don't even think that it's necessarily the fault of one individual journalist. I don't think it's the fault of one individual outlet. It's a cultural shift that we've seen. And there's all kinds of reasons for it. There's societal changes, there's business model changes, there's education and training changes. There's the whole social media aspect and kind of this belief that now you're not only competing with other journalists, but you're competing with all content on the internet. And so ultimately what ends up happening is when you get that kind of cultural shift, we do still have some great journalists, right? Look at the situation in Afghanistan. I mean, the woman at CNN, I unfortunately I forget her name right now, but she was standing on the street surrounded by the Taliban reporting. And I think that every person, I don't care what your politics are, you say that takes courage. That takes something very innate in somebody, very special, to stand there as a woman around a regime that is known to not be supportive of women's rights, to literally be beating and killing women and mistreating women and children, etc. That to me is a level of journalism that most aspire to. But when you then bring it back to, let's, cut the media into the financial media, there's some people who are doing a great job. There's also a lot of people who frankly are just bloggers. And I break down the media into kind of three categories. There's true journalists that do real journalism. They try to be as unbiased as possible. They are not trying to write, clickbait and headlines like that. They simply want to understand the facts. They're seeking truth more than anything else. And then on top of that, they are also willing to do the work. They're willing to talk to sources, verify the information, double check it with multiple sources, take the time to really do true journalism. That's a journalist. On the other end of the spectrum, you have market participants, folks like myself and others who are investing in the market, whether it's the public market, the private market, venture capital, private equity, real estate, whatever, but they're putting real capital to risk. And so when they write their opinion, they openly state, I'm not a journalist. I don't want to be a journalist. I'm not in this from a media perspective. I'm simply writing commentary on my personal views on a market in which I have skin in the game. And if I am wrong, I will lose money. If I am right, I will make money. And then there's this middle group. And the middle group basically pretends to be journalists, but they're bloggers. They don't do any journalism. They write their opinion. And frankly, I think that what many of them have been doing is they've been tearing apart the fabric of our society. It used to be that people feared the media. They didn't want to get on the wrong side of the media. But now what we have is there's a lot of people who have bigger platforms than the media, right? And what they've been able to do is they've been able to now say the truth. And we live in a free country, a democratic situation where we should not fear saying the truth. And if the media is not going to hold people accountable, then we have to do it. And we also have to hold the media accountable. And so when they write things that are inaccurate, somebody needs to say that's inaccurate. And here's why. When they write something that is obviously biased and they present it as not opinion pieces, but as fact, we should say that is biased. That is inaccurate. And on top of that, I think what you've gotten is a lot of the financial media is now owned by fiat billionaires. And so when you look at a fiat billionaire who is financially incentivized to protect their empire by attacking a digital currency, what you get is you get their employees, people who directly take a paycheck from a fiat billionaire. They write the talking points of their fiat billionaire bosses and the state. And so if we go back and we look all last year, I could point to article after article after article, how many journalists wrote and celebrated all of the Federal Reserve's monetary policy decisions. How many people were celebrating the fiscal policy decisions? They were literally writing articles saying, don't worry about it. Inflation won't be a problem. Those same people today are writing articles being like, we don't know where inflation came from. It's transitory. It's yada, yada, whatever. They don't understand the market. They have no skin in the game. They literally are merely spectators sitting in the stands Monday morning quarterbacking. If they believed what they wrote, they would put skin in the game. If they don't have skin in the game, they merely are writing opinion pieces. They are a blogger. And if you're going to write opinion pieces and you have no negative consequences when you are wrong, then why should anyone listen to you? Because you can simply write bad take after bad take after bad take. And what ended up happening is twofold. One, when the market crashed last year, they were fear mongering, telling everyone the market was going down forever, et cetera. Well, now we have the data, and guess who sold stocks? Most of the stock selling last year in March of 2020 was older people who were worried about their retirement savings disappearing. And so the very people who probably need that capital the most sold on the way down. And then the market turned around and it ripped in everyone's faces and it hit all-time high after all-time high. In 2021, literally, like 1 out of every 3 trading days, we've hit an all-time high. And so those people who sold their assets last year out of fear because they were listening to the talking heads in the financial media, they got screwed. But who helped them? Who is going to hold those people accountable? Nobody. So on top of that, now we have people who are presenting, again, inflation. I mean, how many articles do we have to read that inflation is transitory? And then all of a sudden, we have 5% plus CPI, 13-year high in CPI, 30-year high in core inflation. We have the Biden administration just upped their inflation expectation for Q4 of this year from 2% to 4.8%. They more than doubled it. You have 10.5 million open jobs in America. Never been more open jobs in America ever. And we still have 5+% unemployment. And so when you start to look at this, you say, wait a second, those facts don't match up with what the media has been telling me. And then you go a step further and you say, they've been yelling and screaming about $15 minimum wage. 80% of American workers already get paid $15 or more an hour. 80%. The free market already instituted a minimum wage of $15 or more. And so again, it's just the facts don't line up with the narrative. And then when you start to look at a lot of the decisions that are made, you start to unpack this and say, why are they saying this stuff? And it's simply one of two things. Either they don't understand how it works and they're merely regurgitating the things that they're being told. So there's a lack of competency for the folks who fall in this kind of blogger category, or they actually are being malicious and they're saying things they know to be untrue to simply elicit all sorts of clicks and controversy and trolling, etc. And again, this isn't everybody. It's very specific people within the media. But when you look at this and you say to yourself, okay, how many people yesterday, when the White House's National Economic Council was talking about the grocery price index and trying to manipulate the data to tell people it was okay, that groceries are up significantly over the last year, which, by the way, doesn't hurt rich people. It hurts the poorest people in our society because it's an outsized percentage of their monthly spending. How many critical articles were written? How many people are going to hold the National Economic Council accountable? How many people are going to push back on it? Didn't see many people doing that. But you know who did push back on them? People with skin in the game. The Bitcoiners all over the internet saying this is absolute nonsense. And it's because the Bitcoin community actually understands how the economy works better than the traditional media writers do for the most part. They have skin in the game. If they're wrong, they lose money, a lot of money. If somebody writes an opinion piece and it's wrong, nothing happens. If a lot of people clicked on it, actually they get congratulated. They get a promotion. They get a bonus, right? It's insane. And so you actually even have media outlets, which is a dirty secret of some of them, where you are congratulated if you move markets. So think about that for a second. We have media companies where literally the internal incentives is to write articles to move the market. Where I come from, that's called manipulation, right? Imagine if I said, hey, I'm going to go out, I'm going to create a piece of content to manipulate the market. People will be all over me. But that is literally an incentive inside of some of these traditional media companies. And so when you start to think about this, you just say to yourself, wait a second. Everybody that I know now has a television studio inside their home, right? We don't need their permission. We don't need to listen to them. We don't need to have them play gatekeeper. You've seen this over and over again. Founders, investors, and market participants can go direct to the audience themselves. I can tweet directly to my audience, and I will reach more people doing that than I will having anyone else write any article in a traditional media outlet. And that's not unique to me. That is true of most people on social media. And so what you're starting to see is, rather than complain about the problems, let's just go build a better system. Let's just go build something that's better. And maybe we're successful or maybe we're not. Frankly, we're naive. It's probably more difficult than we all think it is, but we're making progress. And that's from founders, that's from investors, that's from other market participants. But what ends up occurring, I think, is in the financial world, in the business world, and especially in the tech world, people don't spend a lot of time complaining about stuff because they realize, look, it just doesn't really, nothing's going to change. It doesn't matter how much we yell and scream about it. Nothing's going to change. So it's either build something better or shut up. And I think that's what you're watching happen is people are saying, okay, but if I was the traditional media, I wouldn't want to be competing with these people that are the market participants. because ultimately they have something that the media can't compete on. They have authenticity and truth. They're not held to any talking points. They're not held to any narrative. They're not there to try to hold some sort of facade of we're almighty and above you. You can't beat authenticity and truth. And I think that's ultimately what we're watching happen. And that's why you're seeing so many market participants with such massive audiences, because they're simply saying, we're going to tell you what we think, and we're going to tell you, and we're going to call it our bias, and then you decide for yourself. And that's ultimately, to me, that's the biggest shift the internet has provided, is no longer do people sit back and say, tell me what to think. Instead, now people can go find the information themselves and make their own decisions. And I think that that's a fundamental shift in society. And that's why you see a lot of these businesses having to scramble to figure out how do they continue to grow their business at a time when, the market forces are moving against them.
I agree with everything you just said. I mean, that was a legendary rant right there on everything in terms of, the media and all the impact that the internet has had. And you're totally right. I mean, in terms of, what one specific point made me think of around market manipulation is Nellie Bowles, who wrote for the New York Times. I think she still might, she put out a personal blog about how there is a legitimate culture within those walls where you want to get a quote unquote kill, where you find someone and you write a hit piece on them enough where it brings them down. And you basically, you have a scalp is what you have. And that is just such a negative mentality. And everything you just said is just so optimistic and positive. And I think that, look, that's, I think that's why you've built the following that you have is because it is that, you're wearing the shirt right now, the trillionaire energy, the ability to go out and create something and opt out of the system, because I think that that's what a lot of people are starting to realize, right? Is that the system is just so old and cumbersome and bureaucratic that it's super hard to work within it. And back to the beginning of the conversation, sure, the legislation that Bitcoiners wanted did not get passed, but it may not actually matter in the end.
Yeah, I think the Nellie Bowles thing, I'm not familiar exactly with that specific piece, but this idea that, there's a societal shift that has definitely happened around cancel culture and kind of takedowns and all this stuff. And frankly, it's just super elementary, right? Because what ends up happening is, I forget who tweeted this once. Maybe it was Naval or Blasi or somebody, but they basically are like, look, cancel culture continues until those that do the canceling start to get canceled. And what you have to remember is that when you create a culture like that, nobody is safe, right? They'll come for anybody. They don't care who you are. How many people have we seen that were, put up on these pedestals by society and then just as quickly torn down? And so ultimately, I think that that kind of works itself out. It may take a while, but again, if you're doing a lot of canceling, eventually somebody comes for you. And so you're better off just not playing that game. The second thing is, I think that by going direct, you remove a lot of the risk. You're no longer beholden to what the mainstream media or others want to say about you. And that doesn't mean that you're immune to making mistakes. That doesn't mean that you're immune to saying dumb things or doing that. Actually, that's what makes you human. And I think that what we're doing is we're entering a society where it used to be that folks would show up in their 3-piece suit and they would basically, pretend like they did no wrong and they had this moral superiority and stuff. Now people run for president like, yeah, I did cocaine. I smoked weed. Like, by the way, did you go to high school? Right? Like, it's just a whole different kind of society. And again, does that make it right or wrong? Like, it almost doesn't matter. It's just that people are willing to be much more authentic. They're willing to directly appeal to individuals. And there's more power in being humane and showing that humanity than it is in, trying to pretend like you're somebody that you're not. And I think that that's probably one of the most interesting parts of social media and people building these large audiences is you start to build a level of trust. And that trust doesn't come from always presenting your best foot forward. It comes from actually telling the truth, from posting a photo that when you don't look your best, right? And having some self-deprecating humor and being able to, I think, just kind of not take yourself too seriously. And, I'm the first one to say it. I've done all kinds of dumb stuff in my life. right? I was a 19-year-old kid once, right? Like, and so did everybody else. And so rather than trying to pretend like we all have this like perfect life and do everything correct all the time, instead it's just saying, look, I'm going to make a lot of mistakes. But as long as I make more good decisions than bad decisions, and as long as I'm happy and I get to do the things every day that I want to do and they don't harm anyone else, I live a great life. Like I win, right? And I think that's ultimately what we're seeing play out here now is the game has changed. People no longer want to play only a status game, right? There are still people who play it. There are still some people who find value in it, but there's a whole nother group of people who say, wait a second, the status game is not necessarily the game that I need to play or want to play. Instead, I want to play this other game. And I think that is a really positive for society. And it's a more positive sum view of the world. Right? I don't need to take you down for me to win. I don't need to take you down to have some level of self-worth or feel better about myself. Instead, I can celebrate when my friends win. And I also can celebrate when people who maybe I don't see eye to eye with, they win as well. And it kind of goes back to this idea of like, there's a lot of folks in our society, I think, who believe free speech is good as long as you say what they believe. Right? But if you start saying things they don't believe with, then all of a sudden they want to censor you. They want to tell you to shut up. They don't want you to have a voice. Well, that's the true test of how much do you believe in free speech is, are you willing to protect those that say things that you disagree with? And I think that there's just, again, this level of complacency, this softness that basically has permeated society where people are more worried about upsetting each other rather than being able to adhere to and defend the ideals that make America, America. Right. And so you don't have to do it in a negative or arrogant or malicious way, but you still can be a proponent of free speech. You can still be a proponent of protecting those that you don't agree with or do things that you wouldn't do. And it goes all the way to having some level of compassion. I think that, when you live in a culture where everyone is trying to create the next takedown, there's not a lot of compassion there. Right. And so I always kind of chalk it up and I say, look, everyone is going to hopefully pursue the things that make them happy. If somebody works at a large media company and they run around and their whole goal is to take people down and that genuinely makes them happy, good for them. But I just don't think that that's a fun way for me to live my life. And so rather than worry about everybody else, I'll just worry about myself. I'll go about doing the things that make me happy. And, it'll all work itself out at the end. I got a pretty good life. I don't have that many complaints.
Well, that's because you live in Miami now, but the whole takedown thing, it really is, it's like you're trading on someone else's name too. It's like you take this, you wait for someone else to do all the work of building up their name or their company. And then you step in and you say, okay, I'm actually going to try to take some of that status and trade off of it. The last point here on the cancellation thing is the whole cancel culture. It's predicated on humans being perfect. Right. Which is just not inherently, nobody's perfect. It's inherently not true. And it just goes against all logic because, ask someone, it's also anti-grace, right? You ask someone, okay, if you're for canceling this person forever, are you also for people serving out lifetime sentences only in prison? Like, why not just kill people in prison? Like the whole point is that you serve a sentence that's, fitting to the crime. So these permanent cancellations, I think they're going to stop. I think you're totally right. I think that people are starting to understand that authenticity and truth, even if that comes with a little bit of imperfection, is kind of the way to go. Let's wrap up here. I know we're bumping against our time. Why don't you give us just a little bit about the Best Business Show? I know it's a new product of yours in the media, the Pomp Media Empire. Why should folks tune in?
Yeah, honestly, it's my brothers and myself, and my wife joins sometimes, and we just talk about current events. And what we started to realize was there was a huge lack of financial education in our country and elsewhere, but specifically in the United States, our focus. And a lot of that is driven by people feeling like they can't get ahead. 80% of millionaires in the United States never inherited a single dollar. 33% of millionaires in the US never made more than 100 grand in a single year. It's just pure personal finance 101, having discipline for a long period of time. That's ultimately what drives a significant amount of wealth creation in our country. And so where else do you learn that? You don't learn it in school. Most people don't have a parent, a friend, a mentor, et cetera, that sits them down and talks to them about it. And so we don't have everything figured out. Actually, there's a lot of stuff we don't know. Probably we've got assumptions about things that are wrong, but we know some things and we've done pretty well for ourselves. And so every day for 2 hours, 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern on YouTube, we just stream live, talk about the current events, try to explain and educate people. And then the fact that it's my brothers, we like to have a little bit of fun too. We get a little wild sometimes, joke around, make people laugh. But ultimately, it's just us saying, look, we are no different than anybody else. Most of the audience is similar to us. They grew up, they did the same things. They eat at the same places. They do the same activities. They watch the same things, in culture, et cetera. And so it's a kind of a unique way for us to do some education, but it's wrapped in this kind of entertainment and almost comedy to some degree, wrapper that I think people are really receptive to. And most people, they're at home working, they throw it on television or, on another tab, and they kind of watch as they get some work done. And it's a pretty good time. So we'll keep doing it as long as we keep having fun. But so far, so good.
Okay. So 11 to 2 or 11 to 1 Eastern time every day. The Pomp Podcast, everyone should subscribe to that, follow him on Twitter and sign up for the Pomp Letter. I appreciate you coming on. It's been a blast.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Pomp.